The Japanese women braced for the whipping crack of cruelty, but instead a cowboy tipped his hat and whispered, "Ma'am, you're safe now." The winter wind bit at their faces as the Japanese women POWs were marched through the wooden gates of the remote American camp. Their legs trembled from hunger, their minds tormented by the terrifying stories they had been told. Americans would treat them like animals, like trophies, like enemies unworthy of breath. But the moment they entered, everything twisted into something unreal. Cowboys, real cowboys with dust-worn boots and sun-scarred hands, came forward not with rifles raised, but with blankets. One draped soft wool over a woman's shaking shoulders, while another carried a bucket of warm water to wash their frost-bitten fingers. The women waited for the trap, for the cruelty promised by propaganda. But instead, the cowboys lifted them gently onto wagons, speaking words they didn't yet understand, words of comfort, not threat. And in that moment, fear collided with bewildering kindness, and their journey into the unknown truly began. The gates of the American camp creaked open, and the women shuffled forward, unsure of what awaited them beyond the barbed wire. They had been told that surrender was a fate worse than death, that their captors would strip them of every shred of dignity. The propaganda they had been raised on was heavy in their minds, like a storm cloud that threatened to swallow them whole. The stories they had heard, whispered in the barracks, promised humiliation, torture, and a brutal existence. Some feared that they would be thrown into slave labor, others that they would be executed with no more than a mocking laugh. The war had taught them that to be captured meant to lose everything. There was no other way. But as the women stepped through the gates, nothing about their new world was what they had imagined. The camp was strangely quiet, almost serene. The air smelled not of smoke and blood, but of earth and fresh bread. No barking dogs, no rifle butts raised. Instead, soldiers in worn uniforms, their faces tired but calm, watched them with quiet detachment. They didn't shout orders or sneer. They didn't leer with victory. They merely observed, waiting for the women to move forward. And then a man in a weathered cowboy hat stepped forward. His boots crunched on the gravel, and for a moment the women froze. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had seen years of hard labor under the sun. His hands were rough, calloused, and the sight of them made the women stiffen. He looked like the enemy they had been taught to fear, yet his eyes, clear and steady, didn't hold the malice they expected. "Come on now, ladies," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "We'll get you cleaned up." The women stood, rooted to the ground, unable to move or speak. This was not the reception they had been prepared for. "Who are you?" one of the women whispered, her voice shaking with disbelief. "I'm just a cowboy, ma'am," he said with a smile. "Now, let's get you some food and warmth." This simple, unexpected kindness shattered the world the women had lived in. They had been raised to see the Americans as demons, as enemies who would stop at nothing to break them. Yet here was this man, a cowboy, offering them blankets, food, and care. He didn't treat them as prisoners or enemies. He treated them as people, as human beings. And that was a revelation so profound it left them speechless. As the days passed, the women began to notice more contradictions. The guards, some of whom were cowboys, walked through the camp with a quiet ease. They didn't shout or make demands. They weren't brutal. They simply did their jobs with a detached professionalism that left the women confused. Some of the guards even smiled at them, nodding as they passed, as though the women weren't their enemies at all. And then there was the food. For weeks, the women had been starving, their bodies thin and weak from lack of sustenance. But here, they were given fresh meals, hot soup, bread, and meat. It wasn't the scraps they had feared. It wasn't poison. It was real food, nourishing and warm. With every meal, with every small act of kindness, the women's world tilted further out of balance. They had been taught to fear the enemy, to believe that surrender was worse than death. But now they found themselves questioning everything they had been told. Was it possible that the Americans weren't the monsters they had imagined? Was it possible that these men, who had fought against their country, could show them more humanity than their own had? The shock was almost too much to bear. It left the women numb, unsure of how to respond. They had been prepared to hate, to resist with all their strength. But what were they supposed to do when faced with this unexpected mercy? How could they reconcile the softness of the cowboys' gestures with the brutal stories of war they had been raised on? Could they trust these men, or was it all part of some grand deception? It was in these moments, amid the quiet routines of the camp, that the women began to unravel. Their fears, once so tightly wound, began to loosen. The walls they had built to protect themselves from the horrors of captivity slowly began to crumble, and with them went their most deeply held beliefs. For the first time, they had to face the possibility that the world they had known was not the only world. There was more to humanity than war and violence, and as the women began to accept this new reality, they found themselves caught in the quiet tension between the old world they had left behind and the new one they were slowly being drawn into. The weight of their military training came crashing down on them. They had been raised in a system that demanded total loyalty and sacrifice, one that left no room for doubt or questioning. The Japanese military had instilled in them a strict code, a philosophy of absolute discipline, where honor meant everything. From a young age they had been taught to endure suffering without complaint, to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the nation and the emperor. There was no room for weakness in this world. Pain was to be endured, death was to be accepted, and most importantly, surrender was unthinkable. These women were no different from the many other soldiers in the imperial army. They had undergone years of grueling training, conditioned to view the world through the lens of Bushido, the ancient code of the warrior. This ideology seeped into their veins, shaping every aspect of their worldview. Honor was tied to victory, and defeat was worse than death. If they were captured, they would dishonor their families, their ancestors, and their emperor. Surrender meant failure. To yield meant a complete loss of identity. It was a concept so deeply ingrained that it shaped not only their military careers, but their very sense of self. From the moment they enlisted, they were told stories of the cruel fate that awaited any soldier who failed to fight to the death. They had heard the stories of POWs who were mistreated by the enemy, their bodies broken and minds destroyed. They were warned to expect the worst if they were ever captured, to steel themselves for torture, humiliation, and starvation. The enemy, they were told, would strip them of their dignity. They would become slaves to the American forces, subjected to cruel experiments, and reduced to nothing more than animals. It was this ideology, this deeply rooted belief in the inherent brutality of the Americans that shaped the women's initial reaction when they were led into the camp. They had been taught that surrender meant suffering beyond imagination. They had been told that the Americans would show no mercy. And yet, here they were, receiving food, warmth, and care from the very people they had been conditioned to fear. The contrast between their indoctrination and the reality before them was unbearable. The American soldiers, far from the savage brutes they had been warned about, were offering kindness, something no one had prepared them for. In the barracks that night, the women huddled together, each grappling with the overwhelming sense of betrayal. How could they have been so wrong? The walls they had built around their minds to protect themselves from the enemy were crumbling, and with them their understanding of honor, loyalty, and duty. Could they really accept the kindness they were being offered? Was it a trap, a momentary illusion designed to break them? Or was it possible that their captors were not the monsters they had been taught to believe? The terror they felt wasn't only because they were prisoners of war, it was because they were now forced to confront a terrifying truth. The enemy they had been raised to hate might not be the enemy at all. They had been conditioned to see the Americans as ruthless, as cruel, as subhuman. But what they saw in the faces of the cowboys, in the men who offered them food and blankets, was humanity. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. What they had feared most, the loss of their honor, their duty, their identity, was now being stripped away, not by the enemy, but by the very kindness they had been taught to resist. And in that stripping, they were faced with the unsettling question: if everything they had been taught about the enemy was wrong, then what did it mean for everything else they had believed? The boundaries between soldier and civilian, friend and foe, began to blur, and the women were left to confront an uncomfortable truth: that the war they had fought in was not just about battles on the field, but about the wars fought within themselves. They were no longer just soldiers in a distant conflict. They were women forced to reconcile the pieces of a world that no longer made sense. The cowboys were nothing like what they had expected. These men, who had fought against them on distant shores, now seemed so far removed from the brutal officers they had been taught to fear. There were no pristine uniforms, no stiff salutes, no cold, calculating eyes. Instead, the soldiers in this camp wore worn hats, weather-beaten boots, and faces lined from years of hard work under the sun. They were not polished military officers. They were cowboys, rough-edged and sincere, embodying a culture far removed from anything the women had ever encountered. But here, in this strange American camp, the rules seemed different. The cowboys worked alongside the POWs without a sense of superiority. They didn't demand rigid obedience or discipline. Instead, they respected the women's space, treated them like people, and spoke to them as equals. It was a strange, unfamiliar respect, one that was not earned through suffering or loyalty to a cause, but simply through the recognition of each person's inherent dignity. It was this recognition that left the women so disoriented. They had been conditioned to believe that the enemy was to be feared and despised, but here the enemy treated them as equals. It was a kindness they hadn't known was possible. The first small acts of kindness began to melt the walls of fear the women had built around themselves. It started with simple gestures, like when one of the cowboys offered a woman a warm jacket, his hands gentle as he draped it over her shoulders. Another cowboy handed them a bucket of clean water and smiled as he gestured for them to drink. At first, the women hesitated, their bodies stiff with suspicion. But as the cowboys offered the warmth of their smiles and the comfort of simple things like food and water, the women could no longer ignore the humanity in front of them. It was strange, this tenderness. It felt foreign, like a kindness they had never experienced. One afternoon, as the women sat in a small group on the grass, one of the cowboys approached. He had a harmonica in his hand, a small instrument that looked out of place among the military equipment. He began to play softly, his rough fingers moving nimbly across the keys. The melody was simple, a soft tune that seemed to float on the warm breeze. The women sat in silence, watching him, uncertain of what to make of this moment. They had never expected such a scene. Cowboys, their supposed enemies, sitting in front of them, playing music as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The melody wove its way into the air, and for a moment the tension in the camp seemed to fade. The laughter that followed was unexpected. One woman, not quite sure of the joke, giggled nervously at the sound of the harmonica. Another woman, encouraged by the music, gave a soft chuckle, and soon others joined in. It wasn't a loud, triumphant laugh, but a quiet, tentative sound, a breaking of the ice between them and the men who had once been their captors. The cowboy grinned, his eyes sparkling with amusement, as if the laughter had surprised him as much as it did them. In that moment, the women began to realize that the cowboys weren't just soldiers, they were people too. They were flawed, vulnerable, and real, just like the women who sat before them. It wasn't the kind of respect they had been taught to expect from military men. It wasn't the cold, calculated reverence of a superior officer. It was something warmer, something more human, a recognition of shared experience, of shared suffering. The laughter, the music, and the simple kindnesses they were being shown began to erode the last of the women's defenses. But the greatest shift of all came when one of the cowboys, a man with a scarred face and a quiet voice, knelt beside a woman who had been unable to speak since arriving at the camp. Her eyes were wide with fear, her hands shaking. She had not eaten, had barely spoken. The cowboy sat down beside her and offered her a piece of bread. He didn't speak, didn't demand anything from her, but simply extended the offering. The woman stared at the bread, her body trembling, unsure of whether to take it. But the cowboy didn't withdraw his hand. He waited, and after a long silence, she took the bread, and for the first time since her capture, she ate. It was a small act, but it spoke volumes. It was not just food being offered, it was respect, it was humanity, and it was compassion. The cowboy didn't see her as an enemy or a prisoner. He saw her as a person, someone deserving of care and kindness, regardless of the war that had torn their worlds apart. And in that moment, the women began to understand that the war they had fought was not just about conquering land or defeating enemies. It was about recognizing the humanity in others, even in the darkest of times. They weren't enemies anymore. They were just people, trying to survive. The camp fell into a strange, uneasy rhythm after that moment. Each day, the women were given food, clean water, and blankets, things they had once considered luxuries, things they never thought they would receive in the hands of their captors. Yet, despite this, every meal carried a deep sense of suspicion. When the women were ushered into the mess hall, the smell of hot food filled the air, but their bodies remained stiff, their minds gripped by the heavy weight of fear. They had been conditioned to expect nothing but brutality. The very idea of sitting down at a table with their captors felt unnatural. Each woman stepped forward slowly, glancing nervously at the soldiers who stood by the food. They had been warned about such moments. The propaganda had filled their minds with stories of poison, of bait to lure them into submission. What if the food was laced with something to break their spirits? What if this kindness was a cruel trick to steal away their will to resist? Their stomachs twisted in hunger, but their hands shook as they reached for their plates, unsure whether to trust the food before them. One woman, her eyes wide with distrust, picked up a piece of bread and sniffed it. She hesitated, her lips dry from the days of thirst, and yet she couldn't help but wonder if this simple meal could be the death of her. Her fellow prisoners watched her, the tension in the room thick, and for a long moment no one moved. It was as though the air itself had been frozen in place, the weight of what they had been taught, and the reality before them holding them in limbo. The food was warm, the bread soft, and the soup smelled rich with flavor, yet in this moment it felt like poison. Finally, the woman, her hands trembling, took a bite. The warm bread melted on her tongue, the soup slid smoothly down her throat, and for a split second, it felt like everything had stopped. There was no bitterness, no trickery, It was just food, food that her body had craved for so long, food that had become a symbol of survival, not humiliation. They had been told that the enemy would degrade them, that they would be reduced to nothing but tools for interrogation, nothing but objects to be used, abused, and discarded. But in this moment, they were being treated as human beings. This wasn't the kind of mercy they had expected. It was real, raw, and deeply unsettling. They were being given what they had been told they would never deserve: care. As the meal continued, the conversation began to shift. The women, once too afraid to speak, started exchanging quiet words. The atmosphere was still heavy with suspicion, but there was also something new, something that had been absent from their world for so long, a sense of connection. They were no longer just prisoners. They were women, together in this strange place, experiencing something no one had prepared them for. They had been misled for so long, taught to fear their captors, and now, with every bite of food, they realized how deeply those lies had shaped their actions, their expectations, and their beliefs. The dawning awareness settled like a cold weight in their chests. They might have been misled. The enemy wasn't the monstrous caricature they had been shown. The Americans, the Cowboys, had shown them kindness, something that seemed foreign, impossible, even treasonous to acknowledge. They had expected cruelty, and instead they had found a strange, unsettling warmth. It was more than a meal. It was a revelation. The hunger they had felt was not just for food, but for the truth. And in this moment, that truth was clearer than it had ever been before. Perhaps the real enemy wasn't the one they had fought on the battlefield, but the lies they had believed their whole lives. The days passed in a quiet, almost surreal routine. For the first time since their capture, the women began to feel the weight of their bodies lighten. Their bellies, once hollow and aching, were now filled with nourishing food. Their bodies were covered in warm blankets, their hands were cleaned with soap, and the cold, brutal air of the battlefield was replaced by the stillness of the camp. What had begun as captivity had started to feel, in the strangest way, like an ordinary life. It wasn't freedom, but it was a far cry from the hell they had been warned about. The camp had its own rhythm, one that was structured but not suffocating. Every morning, the women were woken by the sound of bells, signaling the start of the day. They were given breakfast, and after that they were assigned simple tasks. Some worked in the kitchens, helping prepare meals for the soldiers. Others were given light duties around the camp, cleaning or tending to the small garden that had been started in a corner of the compound. There were no brutal commands or yelling. The American soldiers spoke to them as they would any other worker, giving instructions calmly, without derision. The work was not hard, and there was no sense of urgency to it. The women found themselves settling into the routine with a strange sense of relief. It wasn't just that their basic needs were being met, it was that they were no longer treated as animals. They were treated as human beings, with dignity, with value. At first, the women had expected to be forced into labor, to be worked to the bone like slaves. They had expected to be beaten for disobedience, punished for the smallest of infractions. But instead, there was an unexpected gentleness. The Cowboys, with their rough hands and weathered faces, showed them how to make small crafts out of wood, how to play simple games, how to laugh without fear. One afternoon, a cowboy sat down beside a group of women and pulled out a deck of cards. He began to show them how to play a game, his voice low and friendly, as if they were not captives, but friends. Some of the women hesitated, unsure of how to react, but soon the cards began to pass from hand to hand, and the laughter started to trickle in. It was a sound they had not heard in so long, a sound that felt almost like a distant memory of life before the war. The cowboys didn't force them to play or work. They didn't demand gratitude. Instead, they offered opportunities for connection, small, human moments that made the women begin to question everything they had believed. They began to realize that they weren't being held captive in the way they had imagined. They were being cared for. They were being given a space to breathe again. But as the days went on, the women found themselves in the midst of a quiet internal war. The kindness they were being shown was beginning to erode their sense of loyalty to Japan. The conflict within them was palpable. They had been raised to believe in the supremacy of their homeland, to trust in the emperor, and to see the Americans as nothing more than barbaric enemies. To accept the care and respect they were being given by the cowboys felt like betrayal. How could they allow themselves to be treated with dignity by the very men who had destroyed their world? How could they accept their kindness without feeling guilty, without betraying their families, their country, and their cause? Each woman dealt with the conflict in her own way. Some resisted the kindness, refusing to accept it out of pride and fear. They would not let themselves be softened by the mercy of the enemy. Others, unable to ignore the warmth and care they had been shown, began to question everything they had ever known. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls of resistance began to crumble. The emotional toll of this inner conflict was deep, but it was also a necessary part of their transformation. They were learning to breathe again, to see the world through new eyes, eyes that were beginning to understand that humanity was not defined by nationality, but by how one treated others, even in the worst of circumstances. But that understanding came with a cost, and the cost was immense. The deeper they ventured into this new, unexpected reality, the more the women felt the weight of the old world they had left behind. The idea of loyalty to their homeland, to their emperor, to the duty that had been instilled in them since childhood, gnawed at them. They were captives, but they were still bound by the beliefs they had held for so long. And with every act of kindness they accepted, they felt as though they were betraying everything they had ever known. Shame began to seep into their hearts. They had been taught that loyalty to Japan was the highest virtue, that honor meant sacrificing everything for the nation. To accept kindness from the Americans felt like an affront to that honor. How could they, after all they had been through, allow themselves to be softened by the very people who had destroyed their world? How could they eat from their hands, sleep in their camps, and speak to them as if they were equals? The shame of doubting their country was like a heavy stone lodged deep in their chests, pressing down on them with every passing day. The emotional turmoil was impossible to ignore. When they closed their eyes, they could still hear the propaganda from their youth, the fierce words of their officers, the cries of their comrades, the promise of honor in battle. They could still hear their mothers, fathers, and grandparents telling them that surrender was worse than death, that captivity was the ultimate disgrace. But now, faced with the reality before them, they began to wonder. Was that all a lie? Was it possible that their whole lives had been shaped by falsehoods? The very foundation of their existence was now trembling, and the fear of betraying their families, their ancestors, and their country burned deep in their souls. It wasn't just about their families anymore. It was about themselves. They were being forced to confront something they had never allowed themselves to see before. That perhaps their nation had been wrong, that perhaps the war they had fought in was not the noble cause they had been led to believe. The idea that they could be complicit in such a mistake was terrifying. To think that they could ever turn their backs on their duty to Japan was more painful than the physical suffering they had endured. The war had been their purpose, their reason for existence, and now it was unraveling before their eyes. One evening, as the sun sank low over the camp, a woman found herself sitting by the edge of the small garden, watching the cowboys tend to their crops. She couldn't stop herself from thinking about the home she had left behind, about the life she had once known. In her mind's eye, she saw the streets of her city, the faces of her family, the flag of Japan fluttering in the breeze. But she also saw the men in the camp, their faces worn by hardship, their hands calloused by labor. And, in a moment of clarity, she realized that what she saw in their eyes was the same thing she had seen in her own comrades before the war had torn everything apart. A desire for something more than conflict, something more than bloodshed. They were just people, after all. They had their own stories, their own struggles, and perhaps, just like her, they had been trapped in a world of false promises. The realization was unsettling. How could she reconcile the love for her country with the kindness of her captors? How could she accept the humanity of the enemy without dishonoring the people she had left behind? The internal war felt endless, and in the quiet of the night it was all-consuming. But even as she wrestled with her thoughts, she knew one thing. This was not just a war for survival. It was a war for understanding, for the possibility of a future beyond the bitterness of the past. And that was a battle she wasn't ready to lose. Over the next few weeks, the camp's atmosphere began to change in ways no one had expected. The initial fear and suspicion that had ruled their every action softened. The women, though still wary, had begun to accept the reality of their situation. They were no longer just prisoners. They were people again. And as the days passed, this subtle shift brought with it the beginnings of something entirely unexpected: connection. One afternoon, a cowboy named Jack found himself working alongside a young woman who had been particularly quiet since her arrival. She was tall, with sharp features that had been hardened by months of suffering. Her name was Akiko, and though she had never spoken much, Jack could sense her strength. She worked quickly, her hands sure as she set about gathering firewood, moving with an efficiency that surprised him. As he watched her, he realized that this wasn't the same woman who had arrived at the camp weeks earlier, scared and trembling. This woman was fighting to hold on to her humanity. "You're strong," Jack said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Akiko glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though she wasn't sure how to take the compliment. She had spent so long being told that strength was the mark of a soldier, a duty-bound warrior. But now, in this strange camp, her strength wasn't about battle. It was about survival, about finding ways to live with the emotional scars of war. "I have to be," she replied, her voice softer than he had expected. Jack nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had seen that strength in every woman in the camp, in their ability to endure, to withstand the brokenness of their situation without losing the will to fight. They were survivors, not just in body, but in spirit. And in that moment, something shifted in him. These women weren't just captives to him. They were fellow humans, doing what they could to make it through. It wasn't just about feeding them or providing for them. It was about seeing them for who they were, not just what they represented. The women, too, began to see the men in a different light. At first, they had only seen soldiers, the enemy, the ones who had destroyed their homes and families. But slowly, with every act of kindness, with every moment of shared humanity, the soldiers began to look less like the enemy and more like individuals. One evening, as a group of women sat in the mess hall, a soldier named Tom approached and offered a jug of water. "Here," he said quietly. "You look thirsty." The simple gesture of handing over water, with no ulterior motive, shook the women to their core. They had expected cruelty, mockery, or disdain, but this was kindness. It was genuine, and it was offered freely. Tom didn't wait for thanks. He didn't even wait for a response. He just did it, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The women hesitated at first, but then, without speaking, they accepted the water. For the first time, they began to understand that kindness was not just something to be given with conditions. It could be offered unconditionally, without fear or manipulation. As the days passed, the emotional walls that had been built up between the POWs and the Cowboys began to crack. Small moments of connection, like shared smiles, fleeting conversations, and the laughter that would occasionally bubble up in unexpected places, began to form the fragile foundation of a new kind of bond. The women began to see the Cowboys as more than just soldiers. They saw them as people, too, with their own stories and struggles. The first signs of emotional connection were small, but they were there. A hand resting on another's shoulder, a shared moment of silence. The simple comfort of knowing that, for the first time in a long while, they were no longer alone. And in this quiet understanding, the boundaries that had once separated them began to dissolve, leaving behind only the bonds that had been forged in the crucible of war. The transformation, once slow and uncertain, had begun to accelerate. The women were no longer merely surviving, they were beginning to live again. Each day they woke to a routine that offered them the security they had never thought possible in captivity. The fear that had once gripped them so tightly now seemed to slip away, replaced by something more difficult to comprehend: peace. For the first time since their capture, they began to accept the reality of their situation, not with resignation, but with a quiet determination to make the most of what they had. There were moments when the thought of home, of Japan, would tear at their hearts. But even those moments had started to feel distant, like memories of another life. The harsh truths of the war they had fought seemed to fade in comparison to the small comforts they had been given: a warm bed, a full stomach, and the quiet kindness of men who had once been their enemies. It was a new reality, and though it felt like a betrayal to the loyalty they had once sworn to their country, it also felt like an awakening. They were beginning to understand that survival meant more than just physical endurance. It meant finding the strength to adapt, to live with a changed heart. In the face of this new reality, the women began to question not just the enemy, but themselves. For so long, their identities had been tied to the ideals of loyalty, honor, and duty to the emperor. These were the principles that had guided every action, every thought, every decision. They had believed that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that kindness from the enemy was a weakness to be avoided. But now, surrounded by these same men who had once been their captors, they were being forced to confront a question that had never occurred to them before. What does it mean to be human? The quiet courage it took to rethink their identity was immense, to accept the care they had been shown, to allow themselves to enjoy the small moments of kindness, was to question everything they had ever known. The pride they had once held in their loyalty to Japan was now in conflict with their growing understanding of what true strength really was. They had always been taught that strength was in fighting, in standing firm, in dying for a cause. But now they saw that strength could also be found in the ability to accept help, to admit that they were vulnerable, and to realize that true honor did not lie in battle, but in the way one treated others. The realization came like a slow tide, pulling them further from the shore of their old beliefs and into uncharted waters. This inner conflict reached a boiling point one evening when a woman named Emmy sat in the mess hall, a plate of food in front of her. Her hands trembled as she picked up the fork, but it wasn't hunger that caused the shaking. It was the realization that she no longer knew where her loyalties lay. She thought of her family, of the destruction in her homeland, and she thought of the men who had offered her food, water, and shelter. These men, these cowboys, were not the demons she had been taught to hate. They were simply people doing the best they could in a world torn apart by war. Her heart ached with the complexity of it all. She wanted to hate them for what they had done, for what they had taken from her. But she couldn't, not anymore. And with that realization came the deep, aching awareness that she had changed. She had moved beyond the war, beyond the conflict that had once defined her existence. And she was terrified of what that meant for her future, for the life she would return to when the war was over. As Emmy sat there, the fork still in her hand, she realized that this transformation was not just about survival. It was about reimagining a life beyond the destruction, beyond the hatred, and beyond the lies that had shaped her. It was the hardest battle she had ever fought, the battle within herself. If you made it this far, please like the video and comment below, telling us where in the world you're watching from. When the war ended, the women were released, but freedom did not feel like the triumph they had imagined. It was a quiet, unsettling return to a world they no longer recognized. The world they had left behind, the one shaped by years of conflict, duty, and sacrifice, seemed distant and foreign. The moment they stepped off the transport ship, a part of them wanted to turn around and flee back into the arms of the cowboys who had cared for them, who had shown them a version of humanity they could never have imagined before. But there was no turning back now. The war was over, and their old lives awaited them, waiting to pull them back into a reality that no longer fit who they had become. The women were met with the same ceremonies they had been promised: flags, speeches, and the comforting familiarities of their homeland. But it all felt hollow. As they made their way through the crowds, they couldn't escape the dissonance of it all. Their families, their communities, greeted them with open arms, expecting them to return as they had left, strong, dutiful, and untouched by the horrors they had endured. But the women were different now. The people they had been before felt like strangers, and the world they returned to seemed to have shifted beneath their feet. Some of the women found it hard to speak of what they had gone through, let alone acknowledge how deeply they had been changed. Their families couldn't understand. How could they? The women had been raised with the understanding that to return from captivity meant to be broken, to have lost something irreplaceable. They had expected to return with their heads held high, proud of their duty to Japan, with stories of their suffering to prove their loyalty. But instead, they returned unsure of what they believed, unsure of who they were anymore. Their families, eager to welcome them back, had no frame of reference for the quiet transformation they had undergone. To them, the war had been a battle of victory or defeat, but for the women, it had become a battle of identity, of who they were as individuals and what they believed in. The reactions of their families ranged from confusion to anger. Many felt that the women had dishonored their homeland by surviving, by accepting kindness from the enemy. Some believed they had lost their loyalty to Japan, while others refused to believe that the Americans could have treated them with anything other than cruelty. It was a crushing weight to bear. Their own people, the ones they had fought for, could not understand what they had endured or how much they had changed. The emotional disconnect was unbearable at times, and the women found themselves caught between two worlds, neither of which they felt they belonged to anymore. They were no longer the soldiers they had once been. They were something else, something that couldn't be easily explained or understood. In the quiet moments, when the noise of the world faded away, the women thought of the cowboys. They thought of the men who had seen them not as enemies, but as human beings, deserving of care and dignity. They remembered the warmth of the camp, the food, the kindness in the eyes of men who had once been their captors. The cowboys had treated them with respect, something they had never expected from the enemy. And in the midst of all the confusion and pain of returning to a world that no longer fit them, it was those memories that gave them a sense of peace, a sense of hope. The world they had come back to, the world of Japan, was no longer a place that held the same certainty, the same sense of duty. What they had once been taught to believe about their country, about honor, was now upended by the realization that compassion and humanity could be found even in the most unlikely places. The women were not the same as they had been before the war, and the world they returned to could no longer provide them with the answers they sought. They had been transformed by their experiences, and they would have to find a new way forward, a new way of being in the world, one that was shaped not by the past, but by the humanity they had discovered in the most unexpected of places. Years passed since the women returned home, but the lessons of the camp lingered in their hearts, carried like fragile memories that never quite faded. They had been released from the physical confinement of the American prison camps, but in many ways they still carried the emotional echoes of that time, small, quiet moments that shaped the rest of their lives. They had been held captive by barbed wire, yes, but the real transformation had come from the unexpected grace they had found behind those fences. The cowboys, with their rough hands and their simple kindness, had taught them something they never could have imagined. Looking back, the women realized that the most profound lessons they had learned were not about survival, not about the war or the battles they had fought. The lessons they carried for the rest of their lives were about humanity, about the power of compassion, the strength of forgiveness, and the ability to see someone as more than an enemy. In a world that had been defined by division and hatred, the cowboys had shown them the possibility of something different. They had offered not just food or shelter, but dignity. They had extended mercy instead of hate. And that simple act of humanity had shattered the walls the women had carried for so long. In the years that followed, as they rebuilt their lives and returned to their families, the women came to understand that the transformation they had undergone was not something that could be erased. War could take lives, it could tear apart families, it could break bodies and minds. But it could not erase the changes that came from learning to see with new eyes. The war had altered their perception of the world, had made them realize that enemies were not always the ones they had been taught to hate. Sometimes enemies could become teachers, showing them the true power of human connection. That understanding became the foundation upon which they built their new lives. The legacy of the cowboys, the men who had shown mercy instead of hate, remained with the women for the rest of their lives. It wasn't the victory of war that mattered anymore. It was the quiet, unspoken victory of humanity over division. The lessons they had learned behind barbed wire shaped the way they saw the world, the way they interacted with others, and the way they raised their children. They no longer saw the world through the narrow lens of nationality or enemy. They saw it through the lens of shared experience, of shared humanity. And in doing so, they became teachers themselves, passing on the quiet grace they had learned to the next generation. As the women grew older, they often gathered together, sharing stories of the men who had once been their captors. The war had faded, and what remained were the quiet echoes of kindness that had shaped their lives. It was a legacy they would carry with them until the end of their days, one that transcended borders, transcended nations, and transcended the hatred of war. The cowboys had shown them that mercy could be more powerful than vengeance, that kindness could be more enduring than fear. And in a world still healing from the wounds of war, it was a lesson that could never be forgotten. If this story moved you, please like the video and comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from.